Hello, in today's tutorial video, I'll show you how you can create an effective Google Ads campaign using very simple steps and give you important tips. I will also show you all the different settings, different campaign types, and also my tips for avoiding mistakes that beginners often make so that you can use them for yourself too. In this process, we go through the campaign creation from start to finish so that at the end we can publish the campaign and there are no more questions left unanswered. I will keep the explanations in this video as simple as possible, and if you still have any questions, you can always ask your questions in the comments so that I can help. The reason why Google is extremely important is very simple. First, Google is extremely consistent because it is a pull channel. Pull means the following. You can think of it like a magnet. For example, people actively search for something. For example, the potential customer has problems and then actively Google something, which we all do, where you can then buy something via the Google ad, for example. In contrast, channels such as Facebook, TikTok, Pinterest, and the like are more like push channels. This means that people are not actively looking for a product or a solution, but when they scroll through their Instagram feed, for example, and then between all the cat videos and stories from their friends, they see an advertisement and then buy it. This means that the person wasn't actively searching, but you still managed to get them to buy something by placing an ad between posts. That's the difference between pull and push. Push would be like shoving, and pull can be imagined like a magnet. This is also extremely important because you may know that push channels like Facebook and Meta often fluctuate. This is rarely the case with Google. Depending on the target group and the niche, Google fluctuates less frequently and is also constant. This is also the reason why Google is often the most important channel for larger companies, often accounting for more than 50% of the advertising budget. A second thing that is extremely important with Google is, let's say, this applies to every platform, but what many are doing now is, if Facebook Meta has now been created, that means you are now making a lot of profits on Facebook, you have scaled Facebook or other channels, then you often have, depending on the niche, a certain limit is reached where you simply can't scale anymore, which of course we don't like. What also helps a lot is simply integrating a channel like Google, for example. Especially if you place a lot of advertisements on Facebook and generate inquiries because a lot of people recommend it and a lot of people don't buy it straight away but Google it. And if you don't actively advertise on Google, for example, you're wasting a huge amount of your advertising budget because you're not intercepting these requests, especially if you often have to laboriously generate them yourself. You can also see this here in the Shopify dashboard of one of our partner shops. For example, if you have a phase when you have scaled Facebook here, that means Facebook was doing well here. Well, it was scaled, but the problem was simply that it wasn't scaled fast enough. And from a certain date, you can see here too that there was a very, very big change where I'm pointing with the mouse. In this example, the change was that Google was simply added. This means that you no longer only had Meta, i.e., Facebook and Instagram as a channel, but you now also had Google as a channel. This means that Google has also been activated as a channel. And because the demand was extremely high, you could get started very, very quickly and scale up extremely profitably. And of course, later on, they tried to integrate other channels such as Pinterest, which is all well known, or TikTok and the like, and we tested different channels, but the biggest lever for scaling was, in this case, Google. And that is also extremely important, why you should definitely use Google Ads. Above all, getting started with Google Ads is very easy. I would always recommend, which is what we will do in this video, that you always start a Google search campaign first to get a feel for how everything works. Firstly, this is the most important campaign, and secondly, it is also the easiest to create. Later, you can of course set up a shopping campaign or something similar. This means that you go deeper and deeper step by step and don't rush anything. This simply means that it is easy to get started, and later you can then focus more on Google, especially when you are making more profits and can afford it. Because then you also have a lot more room for mistakes and the like. So always work step by step. First, we go to ads.google.com. As you can see here in the screen, the URL, we need to log in here. If you don't have an account yet, you can easily create one with Start Now. How exactly this works? I have already created a separate video on the channel where we create a Google Ads account step by step. I have linked the video in the video description if you need it. In this case, we click on Sign In Once and then we land on the following page. And this is now the Google dashboard. If it looks a little different for you, don't be surprised. Google often likes to make different updates. In principle, the structure is usually always the same. However, if you still have any questions that are, let's say, unclear, you can ask them in the comments so that we can solve them together. And here we first have to do the following. In order to create a campaign, we need to click on Campaign here, then on Overview, and then on New Campaign, as you can see on my screen. We'll do that quickly. And then we land here on the page. Well, most of the time, sometimes a little pop-up appears when we click on the blue button, which then says new campaign or option 2, for example. We just have to click on new campaign again, just for your information. Here we now have the different campaign objectives. This means we have sales, leads, website traffic, app promotions, awareness, and so on. In this case, we only focus on the two variants, the first two variants, because these are also the two most popular variants on Google. For example, we have sales. As the name suggests, this is about sales and purchases, and you usually have to take that into account if, for example, you have an online shop or generally sell products on the internet. Then we have the second variant here, for example, which is leads. Leads is just another word for inquiries. And if, for example, we have a local store or generally want to generate inquiries on the internet for an agency, then in that case we select leads. This can also be for a local store. For example, if you are a real estate agent or offer special insurances that wants to generate inquiries, then in your case, for example, leads would make more sense. In this example, in this video, I'm using sales because we ourselves sell a marketing software to companies, and we also work with sales. That's why I'm using sales in this example. If you were to take leads in your example, it wouldn't make any difference. In the rest of this video, the structure is similar to that of the rest, just with leads instead of sales as the goal. So then I click on sales, and then a small window appears, as we all see on the screen. Now just move it quickly to the right, and we can see here, for example, that we have the conversion target purchases. This is now automatically created by Google, and a conversion goal is the following, as I will now explain to you. For example, if we now generate purchases or leads, then Google must also know, or you yourself who has bought now, because it allows you to continue to optimize, because Google, for example, works with an artificial intelligence that learns day and night, and for that, this artificial intelligence needs data. That is why we always give Google conversion goals here. And in this case, it is, for example, purchase. You can simply imagine it as an action. Every time a person goes to the site and then puts something in the shopping cart and then buys something, for example, this purchase is sent to Google so that Google can easily continue to optimize. In my case, I get an error message here because this is a demo account for this video. So it is important that you also look here by moving the mouse over which error message appears here, because it is important to solve this beforehand. In this case, for example, there is no pixel installed here, and in this case I click on next. And then another window appears, and here we can select the campaign type. There are now different variants of search, performance max, demand gen, display shopping, and video. Some of them should probably look familiar to you. You have probably seen them before, especially the search campaign, which is also one of the most popular campaign types. For example, if I am looking for something now, for example, if you search for shoes for runners or buy shoes, then a normal Google search will appear at the top, which contains the word ad or advertisement. This simply means that someone has brought up their search query. Then we have the demand gen campaign, which is basically the rest of Google. For example, if we now check emails in Gmail, then Google often places advertising at the top, or generally in all of these things are placed on Google's non-main channels. That would be this area that is all of these little hidden things. Then we have the display ads in fourth place here. When I read an article from a news provider or from a website, there are also numerous advertisements in box format as an image that is present on this website. In this case, these are called display ads. Then we have the shopping ads, which should probably be familiar to you. For example, if you search for a product on Google, you will usually see a carousel with product images at the top or product prices and the like. That would be the product area, which means that would be the carousel above the search queries. Next, we have the following campaign type. We have video ads, for example, a YouTube video. If I want to watch a certain YouTube video now, then you have probably seen an advertisement before, which you can skip, for example, or you can't skip and the like. That would be the video version. And last but not least, we have a Performance Max campaign. Performance Max is not a separate species in brackets, but it is just a combination of all of them. That means that you give Google all the materials, advertising materials, and Google itself takes care of all the placements, which channel gets what is more for the experts. Therefore, it is not recommended to use it for the start, because this type of campaign, Performance Max, needs data beforehand. So of course my recommendation is that you always, especially if it is the first campaign, you start with a search campaign and then continue to expand and test yourself in new areas. So my recommendation is that you don't do the following, that you now say, hey, I'm going to do a search campaign, then I'm going to do a shopping campaign, then I'm going to do a display campaign, and so on. Each type of campaign has its strengths and weaknesses. Therefore, my recommendation is that you start with the search campaign first, for example. Once you have scaled everything profitably, you can then move on to the next goal, for example. In most cases, you would then take a shopping campaign or a display campaign, a video campaign, and the like. This simply means that you build up all these campaign types in your Google account step by step. Exactly. That's why I have now selected search here, as we all see in my screen, and then the next pop-up appears below with what we need to say now, how we want to reach people, e.g. we can say, hey, I have a website now, please redirect these people to this page. Or I now have, for example, a telephone number, people should call me. Or even a store, if you have a local shop like a restaurant, like not online now but locally, if people should come by, that is of course also possible. In that case we have a website which we then enter here. That would be our software, what we type here, and exactly then we can continue here by clicking on continue, which we will do briefly. Now we have another window below, and here we can simply enter names here, e.g. search campaign 1. I have now done this, and then we can click on continue here, which we will do briefly, so that we can now say can set the bidding. Here with the two options there are the following possibilities. The default is set to conversions. What this means now is quite simple. Conversions are, as we have already learned, the action that takes place on the page. In this case, we are optimizing for the goal of purchase. That means that if we now say to Google, hey Google, I want to bid on conversions, then Google will try to bring you as many conversions, as many purchases as possible. Then we have, for example, the second variant, conversion value, which means that here we have a conversion with a value because there is e.g. customers who buy more and customers who buy less, especially in business models where there is now this high margin. Then of course the quality of the customers is often extremely important. And if, for example, we say here, hey Google, please optimize for conversion value, then Google will try to get the best, highest quality customers. Then we have the other variants, for example, clicks. With clicks, you are telling Google, hey Google, I don't care if people buy or not buy, but simply want to generate clicks. That is, bring me as many clicks as possible, preferably as cheaply as possible so that people click on my ad. Then we have impression share again, as we can see here, where we simply want to optimize the maximum number of impressions. My recommendation here would be that you do not select conversion value now. The problem is simple because the Google account, i.e. now with new accounts, simply has no data. And accordingly, my recommendation for first campaigns is to say, hey Google, I want to optimize for conversion or optimize for clicks, because here only the number is important. And with conversion value, Google simply knows too little about your target group, about your customers. Of course, you can do that later and test whether it works better, for example. In that case, I personally always like to optimize for the end goal, where I then explicitly tell Google, hey Google, please optimize according to the end goal. I just want to generate purchases. And later you can of course also optimize for value, for example. That's why I'll leave it at standard here. Exactly. So let's continue. The next option we have here is the option to say, hey Google, I want to give a target value now. That means if I activate this now, for example, I can say to Google, hey Google, I want a maximum of 10 euros or dollars per purchase. To pay, please optimize according to this value. Here is also my recommendation that you should not do this at the start, because the problem is that Google simply has too little data. And another thing is what many would then think, hey, I can only just do the following by simply saying that I now enter 1 euro. Here is the problem. If you set it to 1 euro, for example, then depending on the product, it is almost impossible to achieve the goal, so usually nothing is spent. So this value must be realistic and not just a desired value. But if it is the first campaign, especially if there is no data available, I would deactivate this option by simply removing this check mark here. And then we have the option down here again that we see here on the screen, where you say, hey Google, I just want to generate new customers, for example. So you have to upload lists in the background and similar. That means uploading a customer list here. And I wouldn't recommend that to start with. These are just things which you can of course test later. With the first campaigns, it is always important that you just start set the most important things, and then optimize and test them, because the more you scale, the more profits you make, which means you can easily test more later, especially with more experience. That's why I'm going to remove this check mark again. So then I click on next again. And then I have the following here, which I will briefly explain to you now, namely that you can now set campaign settings here so that you do not only show on Google, for example, but Google also has partner networks, for example, that you can also display in the search results. You can leave that activated. In this case, I leave it activated too. And then we have display network here. I would leave that deactivated because, let's put it this way, if you don't explicitly optimize for it, it's rather counterproductive. So I would like to deactivate it for now, which we will do briefly. Of course, this has its advantages and disadvantages, but in this case, we want to do an explicit search campaign. For example, if someone says, hey, I am now looking for shoes for runners that I want to buy online, then we want to have the best search result for that. Because let's put it this way, Google is a very, very large network. We have seen that there are many types, many possibilities, many settings, but if you try to do everything in one go, the campaign will be rather suboptimal. So it is always important to go step by step. It is better to do everything separately, then it is better, and then just work your way up, because you can also create several campaigns later. Because if I have now scaled this search campaign very, very well and it is running very, very well, then I can go to the next step and then, for example, create a shopping campaign, then create display ads campaigns, and at some point test a performance max, because every campaign has its own purpose. And so in this case, I would disable it, as we can see on my screen here. Then we'll move on to the next step. Here below, we can then select the region. In this case, you can say, for example, hey, I want to reach all countries now, or only certain ones like Canada, Australia, and similar. Or now, for example, a specific location. I can say, for example, hey, I only want to reach people in the United States, or whatever you want. What you can also do is you can also say, hey, I now have something more specific, especially, for example, local. I now only have a certain city, a certain area. I don't want to reach certain cities because it might be too far from my cafe, for example. You can also say, hey, in this case, I need the advanced settings. And if I click on it here, for example, then I can also say explicitly here, if I take Cologne, for example, Cologne in Germany, most people probably know, then I can only reach Cologne explicitly. I can also set a radius. That is also possible. If I write Cologne, for example, Cologne, then I can also set a special radius, for example, which is ideal for people who are now restricted locally and want to work quickly and easily with the radius. And then you can, let's say, restrict here too. Exactly, that is the option here. I can also use the pin function here with the blue button here, where I can then say, for example, hey, I want to reach exactly this city now. And exactly, there are many gimmicks. The best thing is, for example, if you have a local, you enter the address here, then set a radius. And if, for example, you are only operating digitally, for example, selling physical products nationwide, then you can work with the countries. And exactly in that case, I'll leave it at United States here. And exactly, then we have further options here. Here you can say, for example, the following, hey, now only people who live in this place should be reached, or which is also the default setting, now people should be reached who are now interested in it, for example, or have been on holiday there. I personally recommend that you select the lower one. Of course, it always depends on the product, always on the target group, but most of the time it is like this when you sell products. Now let's put it this way, when you are traveling, you rarely buy products or services. Of course, there are exceptions, but in most cases, for example, in our case, we sell a marketing software to companies, so B2B and rather niche, and you usually do that in the office or something similar. That's why I then select this option here, for example, that I only want to reach this person, which we will do briefly. And then there is the option, for example, if you are selling products now, which are now not valid or rather not allowed in certain regions, then I can say, for example, hey, for example, I want to reach United States, but for example, I don't want to reach Texas, for example, or other cities. Then you can say, for example, either include is included anyway, since it is logically included in the USA, but I can also say, hey, I want to exclude this place by clicking on it again, which we will do quickly. Then this is excluded here, for example. This is also possible here, as you have seen, for example, if you cannot sell certain products in certain locations. I would say keep all these options as simple as possible. Better a little more than too little, because you can optimize all the things later anyway. Because if you think, for example, hey, this city is not going to work anyway, then it is better that you rather include this city so that you still show this city. And then look, okay, is that true? Do people buy it? Do people not buy it? Because later you can just deactivate it. So it is always important to keep it simple, because otherwise you can do something wrong quicker than you think. Of course, exceptions would be, for example, that you cannot buy in a city or a state because it is not allowed. That would of course be an exception, but in this case, in our case, that is not the case. So I click on X here, what we do. If you have any questions, just comment. Here below, we can then select the language. For example, if you have now selected a different country and English is now not the main language, then you can also add the other languages. In this case, it fits since the United States is an English-speaking country, and exactly then we have audience segments here. And here it is the case that you can simply ignore it. This is more for experts. And since we want to create a search campaign, for example, when we search for something here in Google, for example, if we search for running shoe, then we will see the search results that we all know. After these words here, we want to optimize it, such as running shoes for women, running shoes for men. You can do the same with your product or service. That's why we don't want to target based on interests and can then deactivate it here. For example, that would be the following. For example, if you say, hey, shoes, for example, I'll enter shoes here. You can take your product, for example, if there is interest in shoes, I can make it based on interests, but I wouldn't recommend that for the start, but it will do something else later, which I will of course show you, so that everyone understands well how to do it with these keywords, because it is simply much more effective here in this case, in this example. And that's why I'm going to click on minimize, which we'll do briefly. And then we have the following options, which we will come to in a moment. If we do this at keyword level, first we do the following. First, I will show you the advanced settings, more precisely what that means exactly. And here we have the following thing, namely the rotation. This simply means that if you have multiple advertisements, for example, multiple texts, multiple search texts, which people then see, then you can tell Google the following, which I will now explain. So if you have, for example, 2 ads or more, which is the case with you, I want these ads to always be displayed evenly, no matter what, whether one performs better or the other performs worse. I always want that it is always played out the same way. Then there is the other first variant, which is also standard, where you can say to Google, hey Google, if you have now received 2 advertisements from me, then it shows more often the one ad that brings more sales than the advertisement that tends to bring fewer sales. In this case, I would now leave it as standard, that you then have to say that advertising budget is used more effectively. Of course, you can say, hey, I want to test it fairly now, and then I select this one, but my recommendation here would be to use the upper one, because with the standard setting you can of course test the advertisements too, get results and make decisions accordingly, and then optimize. Clearly logical. But here is the advantage, that let's say you don't waste so much advertising budget, especially since we have partners who spend several tens of thousands of euros and dollars per day. That's why an option like this is ideal for being able to manage everything effectively. Then we have more settings here again. And then we see here in the options that open up that we can also set the start date and end date. I personally do not recommend setting an end date here, and I rarely see it because you can deactivate the campaigns at any time, and especially if a campaign is running well and generating a lot of sales, it shouldn't be closed automatically. Of course, in scenarios where only one specific event takes place, such as Easter, which only lasts 2 or 3 weeks or 1 or 2 months, you can set an end date. If, for example, you should forget that the project is no longer running or that this action is no longer running, you can of course do that. But also in these cases, this is less advisable because you analyze the campaign anyway and look at it often, because it usually involves a lot of advertising budget, and you can then deactivate it later. Then we have more settings here again, and then we can see, for example, here that we can also say the following, hey Google, don't show this ad all the time, but we can then say to Google, for example, hey Google, I'm selling a B2B product now, just as an example, especially if you work without email registration, but only with phone calls, because you can also optimize for phone calls with Google. You can say to Google, hey Google, please optimize only on weekdays, for example, Monday to Friday, from, for example, 8 o'clock to, for example, 6 o'clock, depending on your opening hours. This simply means that you can also set the times when an ad should be shown, which is of course cool to have as an option, because if you now optimize for phone calls and now on Sunday evening, midnight, no one is in the office now, which is very, very likely, then it is not worth placing an ad there if, for example, you want to contact the leads quickly while they are hot, or you get a call yourself and you can't answer the phone either way. But if you are now working with registration, email, sales, and do not have to contact people immediately, then you can of course leave that out. And exactly because then everything runs automatically, and with online shops, people can just buy at any time anyway. Then we continue with the next step. Then we have the next variant here. So of course you can add several individual days here too. For example, Monday and Thursday, for example. And exactly, in that case, I'll remove that and then I'll click on more settings again. And then we have the campaign URL option. That's also one of the most important things, because what I said is, if you have to say, just start with a Google campaign, for example, with a search campaign, it could also be the case, for example, that until this campaign is profitable, until you have to say that it is generating a lot of sales, you just have to optimize it more often. That is why we have this campaign URL option, where we can then add URL parameters, for example, which will allow us to do better evaluations later. Because the problem with the standard Google evaluations is that, firstly, they are often estimated, which means that you can simply, let's say Google simply doesn't know, hey, did this order come through this campaign? Did this lead come through this campaign or through this ad image? But they often work with estimates, or in brackets, standard modeling, which is, let's say, rather counterproductive for the evaluation of campaigns. Or another problem is if, for example, 10 sales or 10 leads are available in the system or in the shop, whether Shopify, Shopware, or something like that, then for example, 5 or 6 sales or leads will be displayed even though 10 of them came in. How we solve this is very simple, and that is with external tracking tools, so that the ad budget is not burned. Feel free to use our tool directly, which is called Adverfly. And with the tracking tool, you get your own Adverfly pixel, for example, which you can then install additionally. Plus, you can then add the Adverfly parameters here, for example. This means you can then measure everything accurately in real time and across platforms. Then I will place the parameters here, which we will now do together. For this, I can then copy the parameters for Google here in Adverfly by simply clicking here, copying, and then I can place it here, which we will do briefly. Place it like this exactly. Now we can measure and optimize everything later in the Adverfly dashboard, so that we can then make the right optimizations for testing in order to be able to scale properly. And exactly those were the most important things on this page. Now we can click on next, which we will do briefly, because I mentioned that we still have the keyword level with the keywords, and that's why I can click on next here, which is what we're doing, and then we land on this level. Google has now built in the option that you can now say that Google is now setting up the keywords. Personally, I prefer to do it myself because often Google's keywords are not good. So I click on skip here, because you can do the following when you say, hey Google, here is my link, here is what you do, which was also created automatically by Google or by the AI if you added the link at the very beginning. I didn't add that here, but Google did it automatically itself, for example, by analyzing the page and creating it using the AI. But in this case, I click on skip once, and then I end up here on this page as we see here. And then there is a pop-up window from Google on the right, which I don't need right now, because that's what I meant with all the changes. Here we see, for example, a new beta from Google, but is initially uninteresting for us. And let's put it that way, it's always a little different, but everything is still the same in terms of structure. That's why I can click on X here, which we just do briefly, and yes, end chat. Now we can select the keywords here, which means we can then place them here in this box. As we can see, these were automatically placed by Google, but they are not good. The reason is very simple. Firstly, these are broad keywords. I will now explain what exactly they are. Secondly, these are also keywords that don't suit us. That's why I would recommend once again that I delete everything here and add these keywords myself. There are several types of keywords, including the broad version. The broad version would be that we simply write the keyword in, like here, for example, tracking tool, what we offer with Adverfly. Then we have the phrase variant, also a very interesting method. We do that with quotation marks, for example. That is entered this way. And then there is the exact variant, for example, by simply putting a square bracket here, as you can see here, and then write down here what I'm doing briefly. The difference now is as follows. If I now take the broad keyword and enter the broad tracking tool here, for example, then it will be displayed like this, for example. But what is also displayed is, for example, when I enter the word tool or enter the word tracking, or if I type, for example, how to tracking, this is then displayed here, for example. In this case, for example, it is often rather negative because the fact that it is now so open, as the name suggests, you can often reach the wrong people. If I sell shoes now, it may be that there are target groups who don't want to buy at all, but want to look for something else or just want to find out more. And because this broad option, for example, is so open, it can simply lead to complications with other target groups, which is simply not ideal, since we also want to reach buyers. And then there is the second variant. The second variant means that these words must always be used in combination as an example. That wouldn't work anymore. This means that Google would not show an ad from you here, but Google would show an ad here because this combination of words is present here. What Google wouldn't do is the following example that I show now. If, for example, you now have the two in between, and then Google wouldn't show it either because this combination has to be like in this quotation marks in here as an example. That, let's say, is a little better than the broad version because you can restrict it more, and let's just say it's not as open. For example, if you now enter the right words or keywords, then the advantage here is that you no longer have to do it exactly, which is a big difference than what I'm showing now. And then exactly the following would be the case. It has to be like this one-to-one. That means if I now search after the word tracking tool, for example, here, then this will now be displayed. But now if I search for tracking tool website, for example, then it won't be displayed because it's not exact. As the name suggests, it's actually very simple. With broad, we would see it either way because both words are there. With phrase, we would see that, i.e. with the quotation marks, because these words are there one after the other. But with exact, we wouldn't see that, simply because it is not exactly the same, but there is an additional word there. And that's why it's always important to look here and see, is it possible to use the keyword incorrectly so that it ends up attracting the wrong people? And accordingly, you can look, I'll now use broad, but if I add a longer sentence, for example, then it's just less likely here in the quotation marks that you end up in a different combination. And later in the evaluations, you can see one way or another whether people are buying or not buying. For example, if I see one keyword works and the other doesn't, then you can simply switch off one later and create several variants of the ones that work better, thus constantly improving for better results. What's also important to mention is here on the right, we also have an option if I make it bigger again, which we just do briefly, that then, for example, the search volume, etc. is displayed here. Personally, I work less with it. I work more with the keyword planner because you can see, for example, how many competitors there are for a keyword, how expensive a click is, what the search volume is. You can do this using the Google Keyword Planner tool. We also made a separate video about this. I linked the video to you in the video description, where we then do a keyword analysis and show further tips and tricks, and then see which keywords you can now place the add-on for your product. The problem is also with the keywords, which of course you always have to keep in mind that you always look at the search volume, because if I use something long or something that is not being searched for, then the campaign would be of no use to us and would waste our ad budget. That's why you have to see that you don't find keywords that are not so overcrowded by competitors but are not empty either, so you don't get any queries. You just have to find that sweet spot to simply select the right keywords now. My recommendation here is simply that with every euro or dollar, no matter what currency, you spend on Google and then evaluate, the better you know what works more and what works less. Here about the keywords, I'll leave it in the example so that we can go through it here, and then you can e.g. watch the video about the keyword analysis and then adjust it accordingly here. To get started, I would recommend that you do this. For example, don't use the broad keywords, but rather work with the other things, because you can do a lot more wrong with the broad targeting, which simply means you reach the wrong people. Let's scroll down a bit further now. And here we come to the ad level, to the advertisement level, what your target group will now see. And up here, on the left, we can first enter the URL. For example, we have the URL here, and it complains because we don't have HTTPS in front. We can add that here. And we've included that here. And here's the ad displayed directly. I can now add a display path here, which is then just a graphical thing. For us, for example, you can right now test it for free, for example. That's just what we do now. Type in a testing here in the box here, and then it will be displayed here behind this URL. In that case, I'll leave that out to make it look cleaner. With Adverfly.com, which looks short and clean, and down here you can select all the things that you can now add here. What's currently here was automatically added by Google. As you can see in the preview, Google has created many variations as an example. If this word Adverfly should be fixed here at the beginning, then I can simply click on it here, and then I can say, for example, hey, this should always be displayed at position 1. If I now change the preview here and change it, then I can see the different preview variants here on different screens, so that Adverfly is always linked here on the 1. So I can also do this with the 2. And then this will also always be in 2. In this case, I'll just take it out here. And up here you can remove it, and up here you can remove it too. This means that you now have to see for yourself what suits you, what information you would like to have in it, because for example, not all words are always displayed depending on the device, depending on the browser. That's why there's this fixing option with the pin symbol. If you want to say, for example, hey, I really want to have this word in here now. And then we can fill this out here. Then I'll take the word Adverfly again up here as an example. You can write here what we do, or rather our product. This is ad tracking software, so that you can then measure the advertisements. Then I can remove this here. I can get rid of that here too. Let's make it quickly. I'll also remove this. We need to add at least 3 items, even if not everything is shown. Sometimes only 3 items are displayed here. Here are some recommendations from Google, but in this case, I'll write in free trial period into the box here. You can now, e.g., say the following: hey, I always want to have this here on 2 and have it on 1. This means these items will always be displayed, and depending on the device and browser, this free trial may also be displayed. Let's see if I can see it in the preview. Exactly, it looks like this here. Then of course you can add other things if you want. The reason is quite simple. You can add many headlines here, because if you don't fix this or add other words down here, for example, if I want the free trial or GDPR compliant, then I can write that in here too. Then it's written in here. I can also say, hey, it's made in Germany. For example, if I have now added this, the following is done. This last word is always replaced, i.e. tested by the Google algorithm. The best thing to do is Google to see what works here. Of course, you also have to take into account that, e.g., Google doesn't always display this, like the third word. That's why sometimes it's ideal if you say, I'm just fixing one thing now and not too much at once, so that it doesn't become too much. Then you have to experiment and see what suits you best, and then see later which ads perform best for you and which ones don't. So that maybe later, when you have found a winning advertisement, or ideally several, you can say, hey, I'll just fix all 3 things. And because it performs best, that is of course also possible later. In that case, I leave it out because I want to test these things here, for example, to see what works best. And exactly, then we have this right here. The description here on the right would be the lower part here. And then you can erase everything here, as I will omit the suggestions for now. Here we must select at least 2. This is exactly like what is shown above. You can add multiple items here and also pin them, allowing Google to test them and determine which performs the best. In this situation, I will simply write the following down here, and then I will write something else here again. As a third option, I can write the following, for example. Then I can also say, for example, I want to fix this at position 1, and Google can switch the other 2 back and forth as Google wants. Or better said, Google's algorithm or AI. For example, if I then scroll down here, then I have to verify this here. This is now a demo account, so I'll skip it. You can of course do that to clean everything up, but that would be the following thing. If we, e.g., click here, we then simply have to start the verification process. And if, for example, when then legal topics come up, for example, if I click on this arrow here and then scroll down, then I simply have more information here. If we then go back and say we don't have to add anything, then there is also a note here that Google will use this from the URL and similar things. Then we have the site links here, and a site link is usually always when something else is added down here. It then looks like this. I can, for example, do the following. Then you can add sale, which you can see down here on the right. In this case, I'll simply choose free trial. And then I can then simply click on, for example, forward the sub URL such as what we typed here. As we see here, it is this. Then I can then, e.g., add also more things here, which is of course also possible if, for example, you now have an online shop, an about page, or if you, e.g., have other things like a contact form, you can fill it up more here, which will give you even more space. On the PC, it will look like this down here. So I'll keep it like this. One thing is enough for us. Then I'll click to add. And then we have this in here, as we can see. Then we have a call out here at the bottom left. If we then click on it here, for example, we can highlight certain things. Behind it, if you, for example, have a vegan brand, you can say the product is vegan. And if you have other unique features that aren't always displayed, like those here below, e.g. 24-hour customer service here written in German, and exactly, you can then add that here and Google will then test it. In that case, I'll leave it out here because I want to keep it simple and not complicated in the tutorial. In later Google campaigns, you can of course test this to see how the performance is. So I'll click on cancel, which we'll do briefly, and leave it like this. If we then scroll down here and I move my camera screen to the right very briefly to see something, then of course we have more assets, Google calls it. So you can say, for example, I have certain prices that I would like to add or certain offers and discounts. I can also add a telephone number and I can even add a lead form here, as we can see. So you always have to see what you can take. But my recommendation here would be, if it is the first search campaign, that you leave it as standard and then you can test it later, because maybe you know that from you. How often have you, e.g., saw a lead form so you can do experiments in peace later when you make more profits with Google Ads and you simply have more testing budget? And then you can open the URL option here. We click on it briefly. Then you can place the UTM parameters here, in which case we don't have to place them here because we have already done this on the campaign level, have placed. This will then be automatically copied down here. So I'll leave it blank in this case. And if I then click on next, it goes to the next step. Then I can select the budget. Now comes the verification question. I have to quickly verify myself with double authentication. I'll do that now and I'll see you soon when I'm done. So I have now verified myself. It's just a security factor from Google and that's good. The safer, the better. Now regarding the budget, there is no simple rule of thumb when it comes to the budget. It always depends on the company. A company with more budget can of course start with more budget. But it's also important to mention, especially if it's your first Google campaign, that you're working with a budget which doesn't hurt, because you always have to keep in mind that this is also a test, because it is possible that the first campaign will not be successful now, but after 4 or 5 optimizations. That's why there always has to be a budget, what you can invest without it being so bad for the company if the first result is an example, is not scalable yet, but only later on. Of course, this also depends on the target group. For example, if you have a product that is extremely expensive, where the target group is much narrower, then you should start with a higher daily budget. Just as an example, if the average lead price, i.e. inquiry price, is 100 euros or dollars, for example, when selling private jets or boats, it's probably even higher there. Then you won't get far with 10 euros, so you need to test more. If you now looking for inquiries for a property or inquiries for a local company, then most of the target group are often only 10, 20, 30 euros or dollars. Of course, it can also be 50 euros, but that's, as I said, it varies from target group to target group. It can even be 5 euros. You just have to test it and see what works best and what doesn't. Accordingly, always choose a budget that firstly works for you and secondly makes logical sense for you. You know your product prices best and often have experience, so you can make a decision accordingly. After selecting the budget, I'll keep this on standard for now. Then I can click on next here, which we'll just do briefly, and in the next step, then I'll get an overview of everything we've set up here. Google is also currently checking for errors to check if we forgot anything, but here we will see if everything is correct, which includes campaign type, objective, goal, bidding, location, language, etc., keywords, budget. And once Google has checked this, then you can publish the campaign down here on the bottom right. And yes, I'll wait a moment until it's reviewed, then we'll be back together immediately. So the checking is over, and if we now click on publish campaign, the campaign will be published and then Google will check it. This means that depending on the account, especially with fresh accounts, this can take a few hours to a maximum of 1 or 2 days. For established accounts, this can sometimes even work within a maximum of an hour or a few minutes if Google trusts you, but let's put it this way, that's not a problem. Once that's over, then all is well. It is always important that a payment method is stored, or preferably several, because if, let's put it this way, a payment default occurs because the credit card has blocked it, Google can stop the campaign. That's why you should always have a credit card on file. Exactly. It's always important. In summary, the whole campaign means that you can't then directly create the next campaign for a shopping campaign, YouTube campaign, PMAX campaign, and whatever else there is, but that you first run this search campaign, optimize, look at what works, what doesn't work, and once you've mastered it and gotten a feel for it and get the first good results, then you can then move on to the next campaign and at some point even try out other platforms and do tests. Comment if you have any questions. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe. We are happy about every single one, and if you would like to see more videos like this, you can check out our other videos on this channel. Then I would say see you in the next video. Your Ejan from Adverfly.